with Caitlyn Jenner, I just sort of would make the argument to people where I was like, hey, this person, I very much support the notion that we should be kind and respectful and give dignity and basic human rights to everyone, including, people who, maybe feel like their biological sex does not correspond with certain aspects of their personality or their psychology, generally just referred to as trans people. But I challenged the notion when that happened and when other things were happening with the preferred pronouns and Jordan Peterson and all that. I tried to explain to people like, hey, my position on this is that people have a biological sex that is set in stone in reality. It is a scientific fact. Biologists can explain to people, the gametes and the chromosomes. A good person to talk to about this is Zach Elliott, who I've had on my show, Red Pill Nation, that there are these things that are set in stone that are scientific fact, and we shouldn't orient the language that we use in terms of preferred pronouns. And we also shouldn't orient the rules we have around sex segregated activities such as sports, where you have women's and men's leagues, and maybe even bathrooms. You shouldn't necessarily just let people sort of decide how that's going to play. There should be a sort of like inherent binary of, you have women's sports and men's sports, you have women's pronouns and men's pronouns, which correspond to their actual sex as opposed to just what they want them to correspond to. And I mean, you can kind of see my position is just like biological sex is real, and that's going to have an impact on how we operate as a society, on the pronouns we use, on the sports that people are allowed to play, things like that. And maybe even the bathroom you're allowed to use. And people met that very mainstream position. I think that's generally a pretty mainstream thought, that biological sex is real and that we should use it in our decisions. And that was met with this response of like, you're a transphobic bigot, like just that very basic notion, where I tried to explain to people, I was like, hey, if there is a trans person who's actually suffering from like real harassment or violence, I'll be the first to protect them. I don't hate trans people, but I just don't agree with every aspect of trans activism, which in many cases has to do with the preferred pronouns thing, because that gets back into free speech, where I'm like, well, why should I have to use a pronoun that you tell me to, even if it doesn't correspond to my representation of reality? So for instance, say a trans woman who is biologically male says, please use she, her pronouns. I might say, well, when I use pronouns generally, I use them to refer to somebody's clear and obvious biological sex. And in your case, those would be male pronouns. So I might just avoid using the pronouns altogether, or I might use male pronouns. And the response to that would, of course, in many cases be extremely abusive.
Just to comment on this a bit, I agree with your position that, there's sex is a binary and there's like sexual dimorphism in species, and then you have the now and again, it's not like there's a discrete line between that. So you can say that sometimes you have anomalies or people, there's like a continuum between each category, but you can still say there's a general difference. And the thing about language is the way that we perceive reality in a way. It's how we like describe everything around us. So when people try to force that on others, because language is something that develops organically. Most languages in the world, especially as like the Romance languages and English too, to a certain degree, they distinguish very inherently between male and female. And the fact that language does that tells you how basic that is to human life. And that springs, I would say, from biology. And now that we're in a time, the modern world, where we can ignore that a little bit, it doesn't make that go away. And so when people try to mandate that sex is not binary, and they go to language, I feel like it is an illustration of ideology forcing itself onto something that is organic. It's like you have to like mandate this thing, because actually if people were left alone, this binary is something that arises quite naturally.
One way that I've heard it put, Desi-Rae, that I think is really great is that, you'd say it's really a bad idea and it's really terrible and Orwellian when, I mean, it's a sign of oncoming tyranny when people are saying that like my use of language, the words that I use, have to reflect their self-image or their understanding of reality. That's something that is really creepy, because one's own use of language should always reflect their views and their representation of reality. It's just the idea of being honest, people being able to speak honestly. And the thing that's happened with the trans pronouns is people are basically saying your language must reflect my self-image, must reinforce my self-image, and it must correspond to my opinions and my understanding of reality, no matter what you actually think. And that's a really, really scary, dangerous thing.
Right. And just something else I wanted to briefly add was, so I went to a very liberal college myself in the US, and they had these queer, I don't know, like session party thingies. And I would go to them because I'm a very friendly person, so I interact with the different kinds of people. And this is me coming straight from Jamaica, which is very, very against that kind of stuff. But I'm not like that. I'm a little bit artsy, even though I'm also not what people in the US consider artsy to be. And I thought it was interesting. I was just like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'll call you they if you want, or he, or I saw people doing that. And that's very different, as you're saying, exploring your own identity and having people sort of respectfully say, I will respect what you want to do when I'm interacting with you. That's very different from forcing that on other people.